Orrin Becker, who'd been feeding cattle in the lot across the road from the Sloan place in Lyon County, Iowa, on the second Thursday of April, said later that he didn't realize he was watching the beginning of anything until the day was nearly over. He'd seen a car he didn't recognize pull into Garrett Sloan's driveway a little after 6 that morning. The engine still ticking in the cold the way an engine does on a car that's driven a long way before dawn, watched a man in a sport coat walk up to the porch with a folder under his arm and gone back to forking hay without thinking much more about it. By dusk that same day, half of Lyon County had passed through that driveway in one form or another, and Orrin understood, finally, exactly what he'd been looking at when that car first pulled in. Most people who watch a story like this scroll past without ever subscribing. Somebody had to write this one down, or it would have gone the way most quiet things go, forgotten by the next planting season, remembered by nobody outside one county's own memory of itself. If you believe a story like that deserves to be kept, take a second to subscribe before we go any further. The rest of it matters. Lyon County sits in the far northwest corner of Iowa, close enough to both South Dakota and Minnesota that a man can stand on certain rises and see all 3 states without turning his head much. Rock Rapids served as the county seat, a town of a little over 2,000 people built around a grain elevator, a courthouse square, and a diner that had been serving the same biscuits and gravy since before most of the men who ate there were born. Garrett Sloan farmed 340 acres outside town, 110 of it ground his grandfather had originally owned outright before the farm crisis of the early 1980s forced his father, Lyle Sloan, to sell off that same 110 acres just to keep the rest of the operation solvent. Garrett had spent 15 years buying that same ground back. Not through a bank, but through a private land contract with the family who'd purchased it from his father, paying a fixed sum every spring and fall for a decade and a half. Watching the balance owed shrink a little more with each payment, the way a man watches a debt he's decided matters more than most. Keeping a copy of every canceled check in a fireproof box in the basement, long after most people would have stopped bothering. The contract changed hands 2 years before that April morning, sold along with a bundle of similar agricultural contracts to an investment group out of Minneapolis called Heartland Land Holdings. The kind of transaction that happens on paper between strangers, without the person actually farming the ground ever being consulted about it. A notification letter arriving in the mail almost as an afterthought weeks after the sale had already closed. Garrett kept making his payments the same way he always had, by mail, on the first of the month, and never thought much more about it until a payment that February went missing somewhere between his mailbox and Heartland's processing office. A piece of mail that simply never arrived for reasons nobody on either end could later explain with any confidence. Land contracts, unlike a standard bank mortgage, carry a default clause considerably less forgiving than most people realize until they're standing in the middle of one. Where a bank foreclosure typically drags through months of notices and court filings, often with statutory redemption rights built in to protect the borrower, a land contract forfeiture in Iowa can move in a matter of weeks once a default is declared, the seller retaining the legal right to simply take the property back. Payments already made treated, in the harshest reading of most contracts, as rent rather than equity. Heartland's attorneys had sent the standard notice in March. Certified mail Garrett somehow also never received. And on the second Thursday of April, a regional representative named Kurt Ashfield drove out from Minneapolis himself to serve the final forfeiture notice and post the property. The legal equivalent of a door closing on 15 years of payments before Garrett had any real chance to argue otherwise. Garrett wasn't home when Ashfield's car first pulled into the driveway. His wife Renee answered the door instead, still in her robe, and what Kurt Ashfield handed her that morning was about as plain as paperwork gets. The contract was in default. The cure period had technically expired due to the missing payment, combined with a second payment Heartland's own records showed as never received either, and the company was exercising its right to retake the property. Effective that same day, unless the full remaining balance, $412,000, was paid in certified funds before the close of Heartland's business that evening. "I'm sorry to be the one standing here with this," Ashfield told her, and seemed, by Renee's own later account, to mean it, in the careful way a man means something he has no actual power to change. Renee asked him if there was any flexibility in that number, or that deadline. Ashfield told her, not unkindly, that he didn't set the company's policy, only carried out what the contract allowed, and that he'd be back out to the property at 6 that evening either way. What Kurt Ashfield didn't fully understand, driving back into Rock Rapids to wait out the day at the only decent diner in town, ordering coffee he barely touched and reading the same page of a regional ag report 3 times without absorbing much of it, was that Lyon County had a particular way of handling news like that once it started moving. A way that had very little to do with how fast a company 3 states away could process paperwork. Renee called her sister first, mostly just to say the words out loud to somebody before she had to say them to Garrett over the phone at his cousin's place, where he'd gone to help calve a heifer that morning. By the time Garrett got back to the house an hour later, his boots still carrying mud from the calving barn, Renee had already called the pastor at their church, 2 of their closest neighbors, and Garrett's own mother. Not entirely sure yet what any of them could actually do about a number that large, but unwilling to sit with it alone until she had to. Garrett's father, Lyle, had farmed through the worst of the 1980s himself, watching neighbors lose ground the same hard way Garrett was about to. And Lyle had told his son more than once over the years that the difference between a farm that survives a bad stretch and one that doesn't usually comes down to whether anybody else in the county knows what's happening before it's too late to do anything about it. Lyle had kept too much to himself back in 1983, by his own later admission, embarrassed to ask for help until the worst had already happened. Driving the same roads into Rock Rapids for months, without once stopping at the bank to ask what options he might still have. Certain that admitting trouble out loud would only make the trouble more real. By the time he finally did ask, the 110 acres were already as good as gone, the sale finalized before anybody in the county even knew the Sloan place was struggling. He'd made Garrett promise, somewhere along the way, sitting on the same porch where Kurt Ashfield would later stand with his folder, that he'd never make the same mistake if his own turn ever came. That a man who let pride keep him quiet too long was a man who'd already lost more than the ground itself by the time anybody found out. Garrett thought about that promise standing in his own kitchen that morning with Renee's list of phone calls already started, and made one more call himself to Don Vanis, the president of the credit union in Rock Rapids, where the Sloan family had banked for 3 generations. Don Vanis drove out to the Sloan place himself within the hour, sat at the kitchen table with Garrett and Renee, and told them plainly that a $400,000 bridge loan, approved and funded the same day, wasn't something the credit union could normally process inside a single business cycle, not without weeks of underwriting most banks required as a matter of course. "I'm not going to tell you I can promise this by 6 o'clock, he said, turning a coffee cup slowly between his hands without drinking from it. "I'm going to tell you I'm going to try everything I know how to try." He also told them he'd farmed the section next to Garrett's own grandfather as a boy himself, that the credit union had carried the Sloan name on its books since before he was born, and that he intended to call in every favor and work every late hour the institution allowed him to work that day to see what could actually be done before 6 o'clock arrived. He left for the credit union office a little before 9 and didn't come back with an answer for nearly 4 hours. While Don worked the financing end from town, The rest of Lyon County worked the other half of the problem without anybody having to organize it formally. Word moved through the county the way word moves through a place that size once a family's in trouble. Neighbor calling neighbor, the pastor calling the church directory, Garrett's mother calling cousins 3 counties over. The same network of phone calls a county that size had probably used 100 times before for funerals and barn fires and every other kind of trouble a small place learns to answer together out of plain necessity. By early afternoon, pickup trucks had started showing up in the Sloan driveway. Men Garrett had known his whole life standing in his kitchen for 5 minutes at a time, most of them leaving an envelope on the table before they left again. Sums ranging from $100 to 4 figures from families who could least afford to give it, and gave it anyway. A retired schoolteacher named Vera Lindstrom, who taught half the adults in that part of the county at one point or another, drove out with a coffee can full of rolled change she'd been keeping for a kitchen remodel she announced. On the spot, she decided she didn't need as badly as she'd thought. The pastor of Garrett's own church, a soft-spoken man named Reverend Aldous Fenn, came by twice that day, once in the late morning to pray with Renee at the kitchen table, and once again in the afternoon with an envelope the congregation had put together between Sunday services without any formal collection plate involved. Orrin Becker, the same neighbor who'd watched Kurt Ashfield's car pull in that morning without understanding what he was looking at, showed up around 2 with an envelope of his own and a story he'd later tell more times than he could count, about how he'd gone back to forking hay that morning after watching a stranger in a sport coat walk up to a neighbor's porch, never once imagining he'd spend the rest of his day watching half the county empty its pockets for the same family. By 4 o'clock, the community's contributions, counted out at the kitchen table by Renee and her sister twice over just to be sure, came to just under $61,000, a remarkable sum raised inside 6 hours, and still nowhere close to the $412,000 the contract required. Don Vanis spent most of those same hours on the phone with the credit union's regional examiner, a process he later described to Garrett as the longest morning of paperwork he'd done in 30 years of banking, walking a supervisor 3 states away through collateral values, equipment appraisals, and a personal guarantee Don put up himself against his own retirement account. The kind of risk a bank examiner doesn't usually see a credit union president volunteer for on a Thursday morning with no advance warning. Don called from the credit union office a little after 1, asking Garrett to come in and sign a stack of paperwork the size of a phone book, the credit union's board having approved. After 4 hours of phone calls to regional examiners and a personal guarantee from Don himself, an emergency bridge loan covering the remaining balance, structured against the full value of Garrett's unencumbered equipment and the rest of his land as collateral, a loan Don would later admit he'd pushed through faster than any underwriting process technically allowed, betting his own standing at the credit union on a family he'd known for 30 years. Garrett drove into Rock Rapids himself a little before 5, the community's $61,000 in a bank bag on the seat beside him, and sat across from Don Vanis while the final paperwork printed, combining the credit union's bridge loan with the neighbor's contributions into a single certified check made out to Heartland Land Holdings for the full $412,000. Don told him, sliding the check across the desk, that he hoped Garrett understood exactly how much trust a county the size of Lyon County had just put into one afternoon's worth of paperwork. Garrett told him he understood it better than Don probably realized. Kurt Ashfield was standing in the Sloan driveway a little before 6, the same folder under his arm, looking at his watch more than once, when Garrett's truck pulled in behind him. Ashfield looked, by his own later account to a Heartland colleague, genuinely surprised to see the check, having assumed, the way Heartland's own underwriting team had assumed, that a farm family facing a $400,000 deadline inside a single business day simply wouldn't produce one. He counted the figures against his own paperwork twice before accepting it. Called his office in Minneapolis from his car to confirm the funds had cleared, and sat in that car for several minutes with the phone to his ear while Garrett and Renee stood on their own porch waiting, not entirely sure even then that the day was actually over. When Ashfield finally got out, he told Garrett, handing back a signed release, that he'd been doing this kind of work for Heartland for 6 years and never once seen a family actually make a deadline like that one. Most folks don't even try, he said. They just start packing. Garrett told him Lyon County didn't pack easy. Heartland's regional office sent a formal apology 2 weeks later, signed by someone Garrett had never spoken to directly, along with a written acknowledgement that the missing payments had, in fact, been a processing error on their own end, rather than any failure on Garrett's part. The kind of letter that arrives a few weeks too late to undo the mourning it was meant to explain. The letter offered no real accounting of how 2 separate payments had managed to go missing inside the same processing system. Only a generic line about a transition in the company's mail handling vendor that quarter. Garrett didn't hold much of a grudge about the timing of it, or the vagueness either. He'd gotten what mattered most out of that single Thursday, and the apology, however late, was mostly just paperwork closing a loop that had already closed itself the moment Kurt Ashfield counted that check twice in his own driveway. Garrett spent the better part of the following year paying back, dollar for dollar, every envelope that had landed on his kitchen table that April afternoon. A project Renee kept track of in a notebook she still has, checking names off one at a time as families waved off the repayment or quietly accepted it, depending on what they could afford either way. Vera Lindstrom told Renee when Garrett tried to repay her coffee can of change that she'd long since started a new fund for the kitchen remodel and didn't need the money back nearly as much as she needed to know the Sloanes were still on their own ground. Reverend Fenn told him the same, more or less, in slightly more formal language from the pulpit a few Sundays later, working the story into a sermon about the difference between charity given and charity returned, without ever once naming the family it was actually about, though most of the congregation knew exactly who he meant. Don Vanis still runs the credit union in Rock Rapids and tells the story now mostly as an example of what the institution is actually for, the kind of thing examiners don't always have a line item for on a balance sheet. Orrin Becker still feeds cattle in the lot across from the Sloane place most mornings, and still tells anybody who'll listen that he watched history walk up that driveway in a sport coat at 6 in the morning, and didn't recognize it until half the county had already answered it by dusk. The 110 acres are still in the Sloane name. Garrett doesn't talk about that particular Thursday much, unless somebody asks him directly, and when they do, he tells them the same thing his father told him once, a long time before either of them had any reason to think it would matter again. A farm doesn't survive a bad morning on one family's strength alone. Not usually. It survives because enough people in the same small place decided, a long time before that morning ever came, that they'd show up for each other when it did. He still keeps Lyle's old line written on a card tucked inside his own checkbook, the same plain handwriting his father used for everything from seed orders to Christmas cards, a small reminder he doesn't need most days and is grateful, on the days he does, to have kept close.